Welcome, everyone, to StabilityHub's webinar, Industry Trends for Medical Product Stability. We'd ask that you turn your cameras on if possible, but stay muted until you're asked to comment further on a question. Please use the Zoom chat feature to submit your questions or comments at any time during this event. If desired, you can address your questions to a specific panel member. In the absence of your questions, we've assembled an interesting array of frequently asked questions. This session is being recorded and will be available in the articles and videos section of StabilityHub.com. Today's webinar addresses trending stability topics from the viewpoint of attendees of the recent PSDG meeting. Our panel, which includes stakeholders that participate greatly in the stability process, and you, our audience, with your fingers on the pulse of all things stability. I'd like to introduce our speaker and the members of today's panel. Our presenter is Walter Routh, founder and CEO of Sagana Quality Consulting. He's an ex-AbbVie Stability Director and is currently Associate Editor at StabilityHub. Our panel members are Doug Brown, Biopharmaceutical Director level leader, recently of Charles River Laboratories. Susan Cleary, Director of Product Development at Novatech International. Emily Dickinson, Director of Quality Assurance at Linical. And yours truly, John O'Neill, a lifelong stabilitarian, the PSDG facilitator and editor at StabilityHub. Let's get started with today's presentation. Questions are welcome at any time via the chat feature throughout the session, but please match your questions to the appropriate segments of the slides. Walter, the presentation is yours.
Okay, thanks, John. So this presentation is following an article, or basically it's just summarizing an article that I wrote for the June StabilityHub newsletter. Came out a few weeks ago. And that article itself is a compilation of some interviews that I had with multiple current stability managers, and also some input from discussions that we had at the spring 2026 PSDG meeting. That meeting went really well, and I hope if you didn't make it, you're looking forward to going next year. So we're just going to discuss some trends based on the evolving landscape that we've got in front of us on the stability side. And the key to this whole presentation is right here, is as computer analytical capabilities increase, so do regulatory expectations that those capabilities be used for tighter quality control. I mean, that statement summarizes pretty much the whole presentation, but it's not something new. I mean, we've seen this happening all along. I mean, as integration, HPLC integration came on for computers, we got rid of the chart recorders, or the analog things where we used to weigh paper. I don't know if maybe that might be dating myself there a little bit. Used to have to.
Unfortunately, I remember that as well.
Cut out the peak and weigh the peak versus other peaks. So it's the way it's been all along, and we're just seeing it really heavily now with with AI and all the other all the digitalization options that are out there. It's just amazing. So I divided this up into two types of trends. The article talks about regulatory trends and logistical trends, and then there's 5 trends each, just to keep the list from being too long. The first 5 are regulatory, and the gist of that is basically things that have to do with audits, inspections, guidelines changes, etc. And essentially, it's things that are going to cost resources. But of course, as we go through the list, please forgive me if it's not one of the things that you just got an observation for or something, but at the same time, as John noted, questions are welcome throughout. So if you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, I really think this is something going on, we are happy to hear that. I am happy to hear contradictions to what I have as 5 trends. I don't want to insist that these are the top 5. Okay. So the first thing on the list in the article was data integrity. And there's just an evolution, a continuous evolution of data integrity. We started with Alcoa. I mean, I remember Alcoa used to be, it was just a matter of initial dating and signing, your corrections and making sure that the pH meter spit out a result consistent with, what you had on your paper, things like that. But now we're at Alcoa plus plus. It just keeps evolving. I think today we're going to be at Alcoa plus plus S for stability. But the trend, the reason it's a trend here is because it's still a trend, especially as I just noted, because the evolving technology, the ability for auditors to see and the ability for us to make our data visible increases the regulatory expectation that the data is visible. So it used to be that a lab tech would put something in the instrument, and the instrument, would spit out a result, and then they would put the result back on their paper. But now those instruments are talking directly to the data center, and then that data is coming either back to the technician or it's going on for data analysis. So the flow of data is so pervasive behind the scenes that the expectation of auditors, of inspectors, is that the path of that data and the validation of that data is clearly visible to them. So that's where the plus plus comes from. Now, the question from the stability side is, what I have there at the bottom is, what about traceability within our study design and execution? And I just think that, the fact is, all these phases of data transfer have to be connected, they have to be visible. But any stability lens as well that's up to agency standards will have to have a robust audit trail so entries and changes like non-routine samples or sample extractions, inserting test intervals, all of that stuff is traceable and defendable. In fact, I think in the article I mentioned one case where a study was one company ended a study prematurely, and they got caught with that because the background data behind it was visible to the auditors. So that's where it's ever evolving, the data integrity side of things. The other key thing, and this came up a lot in the PSDG meeting as well, is CDMO accountability. The FDA recently, I think it was in an observation of some sort, they emphasized that contract laboratories and manufacturers are extensions of the manufacturer's own facility. It seems to be an evolution in the intensity of their connection they see with CDMOs and the contractor. In this case, for us, we can't blame the CDMO for not finding a trend for us. So it's our data. It has to be as if they're the lab just down the hall. That's the thinking behind it that's going on in the agency. Again, it's nothing necessarily new, but the trend seems that they're really enforcing that thought. And because data is so much more visible, they are able to see those connections and things that in the past they may not have seen. Now, of course, a big question that comes up as well is, how much do we review the data from the CDMO? Is it 100%, 10%? And that question can't be answered here, but the bottom line is it needs to be in your quality agreement, how much you're going to review and how much you feel comfortable reviewing to be able to call it your data. That amount of review can change based on the CDMO's past compliance record. And of course, you can go ahead and change your quality agreement to review more or less based on their performance in that area. Okay.
Before you move on, maybe we have Doug Brown with us as well as Emily, and both of them represent some CDMO activity.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, I'll start with Doug, the things that you've seen that are on accountability level where we tend to fall short as users or clients, and maybe the other side of things where you feel that the CDMOs could do a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. John, Walter, thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel. I'll be very brief, and I'm sure I'm going to say a lot of things and echo what Walter says. When you're talking about the greatest level and breakdown of accountability here, you're really talking about, it all boils down to paperwork. And what looks good on the surface doesn't always hold up when something goes wrong. Companies sign these agreements with their contract labs like Charles River, where I used to work at. But when there's a problem, no one can actually agree on who actually is supposed to catch it. And from the agency's position, if your name is on the product, it's your own data. And it doesn't matter who ran the tests. So when a contract lab is missing something, the auditor is coming to you, not them. And the other thing that I keep seeing is that companies are treating data review as basically just filing results. The actual review means, and here again, I'm going to echo what Walter says, means you look at the data trends, you looked for the signals, you documented. It's what you did. That documentation isn't there. You are the one that's being exposed, and how deep of a review, that really depends upon how well you track your records there. A lab with prior compliance issues are going to probably need a completely different level of scrutiny than one that has been working very well for many years without any incidents.
Okay, thank you. Emily, anything to add to that from your CDMO experience?
Yeah, and I would add to that, in addition to what Doug mentioned with regards to looking at the data, is making sure that in your quality agreement you're outlining very specific key performance indicators, because those are going to be what you're going to measure the success of your service provider against. So making sure you've got clearly defined KPIs, but then also a clearly defined escalation process. So if you as the sponsor start noticing that there are trends in the data and things aren't being addressed in a timely manner, you've got a very robust escalation process so that these things can be mitigated before they become huge compliance risks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Walter.
Very cool. Okay. So the next two are the investigations and impurities. It's the first one is deficient OOS and OOT investigations. I mean, this is like the Barr decision all over again. And again, aging myself, I was there in the middle of Barr when they were going through all their legal troubles. And but to be fair, the issues we're having with investigations nowadays is on a whole nother plane. I mean, the focus now, the trend that we're seeing, at least several observations that seem to be coming out, is with the auditors giving special scrutiny to stability failure investigations, and they're wanting to ensure that the root cause is not inappropriately pinned on laboratory error. I mean, our tendency on stability is, well, we have 36 months of completely flat data. Don't tell me at 48 it suddenly jumped. We're like, no, it must be a lab error. That's the tendency. It must be a lab error, and the auditors are aware of that, so they don't want us to pin it on the lab. And then the next area is tracking of degradation peaks, and here we kind of come full circle to the data integrity question. In the article, I noted a company that was cited for some impurities that did not show up on stability. I think I said the 12 and 24-month interval, but they had shown up at release. So there is a trend that's in companies that this actually, I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, I know AbbVie was looking into this as well, that to lock down integration methods and just pretty much any other testing loopholes that might allow subjective analyses to impact the results. That's sad, because I prided myself as a very scientific person when I was integrating. I thought, I'm making the right decision, but now those decisions are no longer in the hands of the lab technicians. Okay. The next trend then is in transportation validation.
Let me just ask before you go into that one, if there's any comment from
Thank you.
panel members on that one. Doug, I think you're more on the analytical side, especially around method development. So any comments about tracking degradation peaks and what might come up there?
Well, I guess I would say that if we're focusing on basically for investigations as a whole and what shouldn't be happening and how do we prevent that, rather than being very specific here, I would basically say that whatever types of investigations are going on, it's basically failing to actually close the test investigation and blaming the laboratory. And I believe, again, Walter kind of alluded to this, without any real evidence to back up those claims. It's almost a habit at some organizations when something goes wrong within days that they log it in as analyst error or instrument issue, and they close it. And I think we've all kind of used to experience that. Unfortunately, today, regulators are no longer accepting that type of a response, and they want to actually see some real explanations. And I think this is when he mentioned about there was a warning letter earlier about the peaks found in these stability samples at 12 and 24 months that were never reported, that nobody was actually tracking that. And that ultimately ends up being a patient safety issue that we really need to start focusing on and have a little bit higher on our radar. There is going to be more significant enforcement actions, and the underlying fix is removing the ability for these analysts to manually manipulate these data so that nothing can be hitting or glossed over or intentionally or not. You have to start to close up these loopholes, and that's a big area that I believe that the regulatory agencies are going to start to focus on.
Thank you.
And I'll add a couple things about the investigations, and I could wax poetically for an hour on how to perform an investigation from a QA standpoint. But one of the things that I've seen, and to Doug's point, the the analyst error, the laboratory error, being kind of like a catch-all bucket. So as a QA professional, if I were to come into an organization to do an audit and see that you have an exorbitant number of deviations or investigations where that's your root cause, I'm going to have some questions. And it's going to go back to how well are your analysts trained to perform these methods? How robust are the methods themselves? So not doing that thorough investigation on a result that you get that may not necessarily be out of spec or out of trend, but it's not what you would expect to see. It's not benefiting, it's certainly not benefiting the patients if we're going to be releasing product to the market that could be suspect, but it's not benefiting the knowledge of the product line as a whole. So, from a QA perspective, making sure that you're actually developing a retest plan or a sampling plan for your investigation that will provide that scientific justification is just as important as the investigation itself.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Cool, thank you. Okay, and the final regulatory trend has to do with just transportation validation. In this particular case, the trend is specifically focusing on stability shipping, not just the product distribution. I really hope in the near future we'll have an article and a webinar specifically on this topic, focusing on those the specific devices that are out there, for humidity, temperature loggers, GPS tracking, and everything. But not to go into too much detail, the bottom line is that if you don't monitor the temperature, the humidity of a stability sample in transit to a testing lab, then you cannot really prove that the sample that's at the lab is representative of the sample that left the chamber. And that's where it comes down to. I've always been a little bit befuddled by this. I love that word, befuddled. I've always wondered why the auditors cared, because if it was shipped poorly, then most likely if it fails, it's my problem, isn't it? But we're still dealing from the auditors and the investigators' perspective, you're dealing with sample integrity. They don't care if it fails because you shipped it poorly or not. So that's where it comes down to there's a continuing trend to find out optimal ways in the industry to track and monitor sample shipments to prevent OOS or OTs that even if it wasn't real, it indicates poor sample integrity. And that's control is what comes down to. Now, and noted there on a side note, stability budgets, something this topic came up at PSDG, and I just wanted to address it a little bit. The the issue of stability budgets is, and per this definition, is managing the time and intensity of thermal exposure a sample can experience during transit and still meet shelf life. It's something that's becoming more common. In fact, it was in place at my previous company where for distribution or product distribution, they would have a specific time at specific temperatures at specific sections of the shipping, like say the first trucking, and then in a certain warehouse, there were certain allowances given within specific sections of the transportation. Now, I bring it up because if your company had this, it could be a really good way of using it to justify and to support sample shipments as well. The key is, though, that to generate one of these, you need some developmental data to support the higher temperature studies that happened in the past, using that along with, say, some of your accelerated data. So it would be a big project. It would be a kind of an R&D-ish type project, but having that to support distribution could be very handy to support stability samples. So that's the last trend that we had. If there's any questions, and also I'll hand it over to John for our StabilityHub advertisement.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is a blatant commercial opportunity that take in the middle of the presentation before everybody gets out the door and after those that were late came in the door. So I'll take the opportunity to invite those who are new to StabilityHub to visit our website, stabilityhub.com. Check out our featured publications, regulations, events, suppliers, interactive forum, job opportunities, and more. And while there, to sign up for the drop-down form for our monthly newsletter to see what's new. We have 1,140 people that are watching those newsletters these days, and we're glad for each one and would like to see more. As a part of the Pharmaceutical Stability Discussion Group, PSDG for short, StabilityHub has resumed in-person PSDG meetings where attenders can spend parts of 3 days asking questions, sharing information, touring facilities, meeting vendors and their services, and networking to gain lifelong professional contacts and friends. We had a very successful meeting in May and are looking forward for future meetings, and also asking if companies in the U.S. would like to host such a meeting in the future. Just get in touch with us at stabilityhub.com/contact and let us know that you're interested. We'd be glad to tell you more about it and see if you might like to host a future meeting. StabilityHub is a not-for-profit service to our industry and is operated by volunteers. If you would like to be involved more broadly in your industry and have an hour every week or two, or even a month, we would benefit from your participation. We'd ask that you send a note through the stabilityhub.com contact link for more information. We're organized and served by volunteers, and we'd like to continue giving our services a greater hearing amongst our industry. So if you're interested, get in touch with us. And now back to Walter.
Cool, thank you. So just as a quick reminder, any questions anytime are welcome. You can use the chat feature or raise your hand. I hope we'll notice the raised hand, but at least we'll most likely see a chat. But again, if you see a trend or something that's not mentioned, we are very happy to hear it and learn from your experiences. Okay, so moving on, then we've got the next, actually a summary of the regulatory trends here. It just comes down to, I've often joked, even while I was a director, I often joke that I really don't think I could perform testing in the lab where I once excelled excelled as a technician. It just seems like the documentation, the expectations are just so far advanced that and verification now includes checking audit trails for illicit data changes and such. So there's so much more that a technician has to be mindful of. I don't know that my brain could handle it. And that's the general gist of regulatory now is there's more and more is being asked as they intensify their scrutiny of the data and the shifts. Amy Wong brought up this quote in her interview, and did bring up her name. I was trying to avoid bringing people's names, but I thought she deserved some recognition. She said inspectors seem to be moving from did you do the work to can you prove the work, the systems, and the decisions behind the work are sound. And they want to know if they can trust the data from start to finish and what proof that the entire electronic system behind those records is reliable and secure. Regulators are paying closer attention to repeated stability failures and want to know if companies really solve the problem or just close the paperwork. Kind of summarizes all the trends all together that we discussed. Okay, so moving on from the regulatory trends, we have the logistical trends, and these also came from questions of the managers where I asked them about their future plans and actually specifically asked what regrets they might have about physical aspects of their program, things they regret about the way they maybe did their chambers or what they would hope to future have for monitoring systems and such. And that led to some good indications of trends. Again, forgive me if I don't mention something that's your big project that you're working on. But to start off with, we have just kind of a mundane practical trend that there really seems to be a clear shift there's a rapid growth in the number of ultra low temperature chambers that are being used, and probably because it's probably related just to the increase in the mRNA therapies that are out there. The interesting thing, though, is that along with the increase in ultra low temperature storage, there seems to be an improvement, along with everything else, more technology, an improvement in the ability of those chambers, the advances in those chambers to regulate themselves, to diagnose themselves. We had a Sanyo that did nothing but stay cold. It couldn't monitor itself, but now you've got, they've got it so that you can monitor it externally, but they not only just monitoring their conditions, but monitoring the health, say the compressor temperature, for example, and things. So you could forecast breakdowns, et cetera. The technology is great. It's moving forward. It's not necessarily a regulatory expectation, but it could certainly save a lot of money preventing outages. The other item that came in the storage side of things, and this really wasn't on the radar at all until the PSDG meeting. It was brought up by one of the participants, something called validation at maximum full validation. It's used by I think a few companies might have been aware of it. I hadn't heard of it till the meeting, but it's a novel approach where when you're performing your empty and full, you add an additional leg to that validation of what they call maximum full, where you place carts loaded with the same test material into the aisles. That question that doesn't typically come from an auditor. Hopefully you didn't have stuff in your aisle during an audit, but it always came from my manager. Hey, did we validate the aisles? And no, we never did, but it was never an issue. Well, here you have the answer to that. If part of your chamber validation included storing stuff in the aisles for one of 3 test runs or mapping runs, the question did come up of whether or not that maximum full mapping run could replace the regular full run. And there wasn't really an answer, but it seems like something that should be considered and could be considered as long as you got it in a procedure somewhere. Any questions on that so far?
We have a comment and a question from Jennifer. Question related to the previous slide. I'm thinking maybe the previous slide, but maybe the one that was just on. Our contract lab will provide the temperature of sample when they receive the package. Would that information be sufficient for auditors, or should we still consider adding temp loggers to track package temp?
So I'll jump in here real quick, and I'll just answer your question by asking you a question. If you don't have the data between point 1 and point 2, how can you answer that question? do you know what's has changed? Because you could have a spike and then go back to normal. You could have a drop and go back to normal. So you need something that's continuous. So it's not just individual target points.
Putting that on a trending basis, it seems like that there is a trend for people to monitor more and more over the last decade. Used to be put in a one every so many shipments to see what it was, just kind of as a validation run. But lately, I've noticed a lot of people are just tracking universally in all their shipments. The only question is how expensive is the equipment you're using? Um, and Walter mentioned earlier that when we get to our August um, webinar, I think we might be focusing on that specifically as people that do these things every day will be making a presentation and commenting on it. How about the other panelists? Any input there?
I will say, wearing my QA hat, if the old adage, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So, yeah, the common, at least for me, if I were going to go into your organization and look at that data, I would expect to see some sort of a temp-tail trend that showed the entire, temperature of that specific package from the time it left the shipping dock until the time it was received at the contract lab.
Mhm.
Okay. Oh, and they mentioned there is one other factor here where they ship sample frozen and they still receive it frozen, but perhaps what Doug mentioned, if it unfroze and refroze, might be interesting to see if that was a potential.
Yeah.
And Emily, I was going to ask if are you acquainted with that happening universally for all shipments, or are there certain categories like for you going into the clinical? Certainly, for human consumption, you might be doing that, but is there any cases you're aware of where wouldn't necessarily be required to do every single shipment?
When in my previous life, when I was working in a stability lab, every single shipment that we sent out included a temp tail so that we could have that data to back up the storage of the sample throughout the whole transportation process.
Okay, and temp tails being amongst the cheapest of the equipment that can be used. There's other much more sophisticated ones available as well. But
Yeah, I know they have the cheaper ones that are one-time use, but then there's some that can be reprogrammed or repurposed for
mhm.
multiple shipments. But yeah, that would be my expectation is, regardless of the temperature condition that you're shipping under, because you don't know, it may be sitting in the belly of a plane on a tarmac in Phoenix, Arizona, and then by the time that it gets to its destination, you've got the change in temperature as it goes up into the air and then lands in, Bangor, Maine, where you've got a completely different set of environmental conditions. So being able to justify the integrity of the sample is best done with some sort of a temperature monitoring device.
Okay.
Yeah,
And Susan,
I
oh,
just want to add, John, the great questions, but you just got to continue to ask yourself, is the process that I'm trusting that's totally out of my control here consistent with my standards? Are we always going to be traveling the same route? Is it always going to be at the same time? Is it always going to be under these ideal conditions? What happens if something goes sideways? Emily brings up a great point. Sometimes, how many times have we all just sat on the tarmac waiting for it to something to take off? You go up in altitude, things will refreeze. Absolutely. And then you get down, it's like, oh, everything looks normal. So yeah, we do have to raise the bar here a lot. And remember, it is going to be a little bit more of a cost to the company, but what's the alternative if we do something and we don't catch it? Now you got major regulatory issues, and that can cause millions of dollars. Forget about just the millions of dollars. Now you have your company's reputation, and that is something that's very difficult to get back once it starts to get chipped away at.
mhm. Susan, I wanted to ask, I know we're going to go very heavily into digitalization in the latter part of the program, but for things like investigations that we looked at before and trending of shipping things, does that come into any of the programming that you've encountered so far in digitalization where people start to gather that data and make it available to come in to be analyzed?
Yeah, well, it's continuous monitoring data. And I mean, you need it in stability. Of course, I agree with everything everybody said about knowing from minute to minute the status of your samples while they're in transit. But this is just from a digitalization perspective, it's considered continuous monitoring, and we have algorithms to collect that data. And whether it's, the temperature, the humidity, the pressure of the container that samples are being shipped in, or the same thing can be said for your facility, the temperature, the pressure, humidity of the facility where you're manufacturing products. So yes, you do need to bring this data into your system. And you also need to have trending tools because it's digitalized. You can have really good, robust trending, but it has to be specialized because you have to consider that you're taking readings, every minute. So if you take a reading every minute and you have 20 sensors, so 20 readings, like a temperature one, a pressure one, a humidity one, and so on, and you're taking all these readings, it turns into a substantial amount of data. And you do need specialized trends to be able to focus in and focus out from a time perspective. So this is something we've worked on before for stability, for our environmental monitoring as well, which I know is outside the stability domain. But yeah, definitely, it's something that's around in the industry, and you can talk to companies. They have tools to allow you to bring the data in from the sensors automatically. It's not like you have to get the sensor and then record it manually. You get the sensor and you can plug it in and it'll download all the data, and then it'll be readily available for reporting, trending, and verification that your samples were maintained properly during transit.
Okay. And I think
John, I
that's
want
a
to
good,
add one more thing here, because for some people, they may be thinking that, but I've always done it this way and it hasn't impacted me. Well, that might have been true when we were dealing with small molecules, tablets, things that are a lot more stable. Today, we're working with biologics, very complex molecules, where shifts in temperature can completely destroy that material. And of refreezing, a slow refreezing, it can cause some crystallization going on with some of these biologics, can make them completely inoperative when they finally reach the target. So this is a major reason why we're addressing these things. And it's not necessarily, well, now the regulatory agencies are asking us to do more. There's a good reason why they're asking us to do more. Types of materials are not what we were working with 20, 30, 40 years ago.
thank you. And I think that's a good segue to get back to Walter's next area of focus, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So, yeah, the next two trends that we had on the list are risk management related. The first is just cloud-based reporting, and again, kind of monitoring and related to what Susan was referring to. And we're talking about digitalization of the environmental monitoring system, not just the data and the analyses of the data, but of those systems, the environmental systems as well. I'll see it in the next slide. We'll see more about some examples of how AI can be a valuable resource for that. But one of the things, moving on with that, on the disaster management, is when asked physically, what physical improvements would some stability managers want to see made in their local stability programs? All of them responded in some way about backup systems. And that just kind of highlighted a really clear trend of a big push towards backup systems. And kind of like Doug was referring to, I think a lot of it has to do with the increase in ultra low temperature storage and the biologics that are going on. What used to be an excursion from 25 degrees to 28 degrees, now we're talking minus 80 to minus 40, so some significant, the temperature increased so quickly and it's such a significant impact that there's a big push towards disaster management alleviation. In the PSDG, there was even someone who had a duplicate instance of a study in another country. Although, that's a little bit on the extreme side. a lot of people worked on having a second a CDMO site ready and in hand if they needed to quickly move material over there. But then, of course, there was a lot of discussion on nitrogen and CO2 backup systems as well, and what to use. But it's just a big deal right now. It was one funny thing is one of the CDMOs at PSDG was very careful to stress that if you have a disaster and you're anywhere near them, you need to be aware that they probably had the same disaster. I think they were coming from North Chicago and speaking that. So you have to choose that CDMO location carefully and make sure they're not going to experience the same hurricane that you might be experiencing.
Let's hold up for a second. We have a question on chat. Question regarding backup temperature loggers in chambers. Our chambers are monitored continuously by SCADA. However, we also have temp loggers inside of chambers as a precaution. Mixed opinions have been received regarding backup temp loggers in our chambers. Any input from this group? And that is a topic that comes up every once in a while. The caution is if you have a backup system that operates the same time as your regular system, we've had instances where our participants have gotten questions as to what happens if there's a difference in the reporting by a degree or two. So we've always encouraged people, if they had a backup system, that either define carefully that it's a backup and that the primary is what you pay attention to. The backup gets its attention in an emergency, and an even safer position is to have the backup system offline or nearby, ready to go at a predefined discontinuation of the primary system. So yeah, it's risky having a backup system going on at the same time as a regular monitoring system. Anybody want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also say I would be very careful if the backup system you're using is more precise than your continuous monitoring system, because that could also cause questions. I was in a situation again in my previous life where we had to, because our SCADA monitoring system was going offline, use our backup system and trying to make sure that our probes or our monitors were calibrated to the same precision as our primary system so as not to cause confusion. So that would be my one word of caution is the precision of the measurement also.
Yeah, I'd agree with what Emily said. You don't want two different ones, but the idea of having something as a backup is great practice. And I know regulatory agencies, when looking at your approach there, will be a lot more favorable to see something like that. But different precision, you open yourself up now to more inquiries, and that's dangerous.
Okay. Yeah, in the past we had a backup system like that, where the device overrode itself, and so that was our statement: is that we just let the device continuously overwrite itself, but then if necessary, I mean that's like say a week's worth of data. So basically, the data disappeared. I'm not saying that's good or bad, especially in the current environment, the way things are. And the fact that you could save that data and could have kept it automatically makes it suspect, I believe, in the current environment. So,
okay, thank you. I think we covered that fairly well. Let's continue on.
Okay. Okay, AI. So I say this for last because that's pretty much the most. It came up quite often at PSDG, and it's clearly a big hit. Now, the biggest problem with AI is that for stability programs, it doesn't come out quite as useful just because it's really hard to validate AI, validate its responses. But a key term that's come up, and I think I don't have it on this slide. The next slide is a term that in writing the article I uncovered called human in the loop validation. And maybe it should be more like human in the loop verification, where letting AI do its thing, but make sure there is a human making the final decision and making the final, verifying anything that might be part of a quality decision. So what came up frequently in PSDG, one of the administrative tasks that was brought up by several civilitarians was the ability to have AI transcribe data from a PDF, say like something that came in from a CDMO, and then it could read the PDF, parse the data into Excel or even into, say, Jump or some other program, and then either you could run that program yourself or have a statistician do it, or possibly you did validate AI to run the statistical program. But that administrative task of transcribing data was pretty significant. You could even use it for transcribing data. I think I mentioned this in the article. If you're trying to put archived data into a new system that you're starting up a new limb system and you're trying to pull in data from the old, it seems like something AI could do. The value is that it reduces the errors and you free up a lot of that typing part of it, but you still need at least one human. You may want two just to cover your butts to verify that the transcription was correct. That was by far the most common use of AI. But I've received a few other examples that could be useful. One is just in your routine data review. You may be reviewing every 6 months, but what if you had AI running in the background, constantly checking for trends, flagging if there was a trend, and then a human steps in? If you had that running continuously, you may be able to justify annual data reviews instead of semi-annual, not because of AI, because annual is actually sufficient as part of your annual reports. You don't want to say, no, we decided not to do it as often because AI is there. That wouldn't be the right answer. But your comfort level with going with an annual review might be enhanced because you know that AI is actually catching anything more that you didn't and wouldn't have caught. And the same idea could come with chamber reviews, looking for trends in data. I have this chart here as an example, just showing if you got your data all in the background with the cloud monitoring that we discussed earlier, you could overlay multiple chambers and see one is behaving a little differently. Now that helps you if you were doing, say, a weekly review of chambers. Sure, you could see that trend, but why not switch to monthly? That might be an acceptable period. In the meantime, you have AI in the background checking continuously. So you've got something way better than you used to have, and you're still only having to review now monthly for your comfort level, and probably something that would be acceptable in an inspection if you're just reviewing monthly. You don't have to tell them that AI is in the background. They may ask. So just a thought of a way of increasing productivity and how AI is bringing that about. Any other thoughts on AI?
I will bring up a couple things about AI from again from the QA perspective. If you're going to use these tools in your organization, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you have an AI use governance policy with your company. So that's going to detail what aspects of your business you're using AI in, what the inputs are, what the outputs are, how those inputs and outputs are validated, and then what the impact is. From using those AI tools. If I've used a couple different Chat GPT right now is my favorite. But depending on what AI tool you're using, whether it's for writing an email or monitoring data in the background, you can get different what's the word I want? Different outputs depending on how you word those questions or those queries into your tool. So making sure that whatever tool you're using within your company, it's consistent across all functional areas so that you're not getting conflicting outputs depending on if it's ChatGPT or Copilot or Claude or whatever tool you're using, you're being consistent. And if you do try to use some of these AI tools, because I can remember going to a conference a couple years ago and AI was just barely a blip on the radar. And now it's literally everywhere that you turn in this industry. So making sure whatever tool you're using, if you have prompts, you have a set of validated prompts that you know if you ask this question of a data set, it's going to give you a consistent response. That's probably the closest my company has come to quote unquote validating. But we've got, this, we call it our prompt book. We want to get, a certain output from a set of data on training, for example. So we're asking a very specific set of questions and tracking the types of answers that come back from our tool. So definitely have a use policy, and then be able to explain what the tool is doing and how that output works in your organization.
Could I ask a follow-
Walter, I just want to comment here to add on to what Emily said, because she brought up something that I think at least this is my approach. She brought up, and we've been talking about AI as a tool, much like think about an Excel spreadsheet. It's a tool. Before the AI, we were told when using Excel spreadsheets that we had to validate every cell to make sure what was being inputted, we were going to get that anticipated answer and not something else. And now we have a tool that can, at least as of today, still hallucinate, and there's more variable nature. This goes back to your point about the human in loop that has to check everything. I'm going to let Susan talk about the security aspect of that. I'm not going to go down that path. But I will say one thing that we want to make sure that we are vigilant is the regulatory agencies, they're on high alert. And in case anybody missed this, back in April, the first very much landmark case came down and hit a cosmetic company that was actually misusing AI for all their decision making because they weren't actually checking. So if anybody thinks that we're still trying to figure these things out, regulatory agencies are a little bit farther along and are starting to put out various guidances like inappropriate use of artificial intelligence in pharmaceutical manufacturing. So it's not that we're on the cusp or we're in the beginning part. No, we're already ankle deep and we're approaching knee deep into this. You must be vigilant in how you use these tools. You must be very careful about it. And especially, I cannot emphasize this enough, you must check to make sure it's doing its intended purpose. AI is a tool, not a decision maker. You, the person, the decision maker. Regarding security, Susan, that's all you.
Actually, this next slide, I think, addresses more in Susan's territory, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
AI with integration platforms. There we go.
I'll go through this real quick and then you go have at it, Susan, because this digitalization is Susan's word. It's in the dictionary. Digitalization, concocted by Susan Clary, or actually Novatech. But anyway, the fact is, in order to make AI, to bring AI up to where you would need it to do some of these things, you really do have to be digitalized. You've got to have your platforms integrated. You've got to have your human in the loop, in that process set up. You've got to have your analytics, your statistical software, and everything all put together, working all together properly. With that, I'll just let Susan go for it.
So I guess, okay, so we're talking about industry trends today. So I guess for me, the trend is that people are moving away from paper. Most of us have our LIMS system. A lot of us, of course, still have our generic LIMS systems, right? So one of the trends I see is companies moving to dedicated systems. So when I say dedicated, I mean dedicated features. For example, managing the A to Z of stability studies, everything from sample set down to pull out to testing to statistical analysis, dedicated reporting. And I really see these digitalization solutions now becoming, everyone thinks data integrity. I think they're more becoming process integrity now as well. It's what you were talking about earlier, allowing an analyst to do something that they shouldn't, merging two peaks or doing something like this. So by having a dedicated solution in place, you can prevent things like that. You enforce GMP. And you close off the ability of people going off script when they're, testing and documenting the results and so on. So I find digitalization now should evolve from just data integrity to process integrity. And I'm seeing that more and more because people are adopting the dedicated solutions. Now, regarding stability study management, yeah, everyone wants to get to the AI, but before you get to AI, you have to have your data lake. You have to. So the other trend I'm really seeing now is integration, integration, integration. People are getting away from information silos. They want to have their stability data and accessible from, their quality management system. And if you have to start an investigation, you automatically escalate it to your QMS system, and everything is talking to everything. So you have access to all of it. And the integration with other systems, and the other big bang that everyone's doing, of course, is integration with equipment, your Empower systems, your HPLCs, all of your lab equipment, your meters, pH meter, your dissolution apparatus, everything that has to feed into that one system. So really, digitalization is much more than now just putting results in. It's really having that data lake. And then, of course, it's the stepping stone for AI. So when you get to AI now, you're looking at what are the capabilities. And I saw, you guys were talking about evaluating the results and things like that. Novatech is trying to look at features we can bring in to bring value. So an example, using the large language model and also machine learning combined, imagine being able to have a conversation with your database when you have an OOS. And you can ask it questions and say, well, who was in the lab? Who did the testing on this? Where was the sample? What was the sample transported? Do you have the data logger information for that? You can ask all of these questions and it responds to you like a human. And you can track an entire investigation like that, all documented by having a simple conversation with your system. And then, of course, the machine learning portion is that it learns how to do the investigation from the people doing the investigations. And in the end, you really do find your root cause analysis. And as your AI tools learn how you do investigations, it can facilitate them and show you possible solutions. And then, of course, the human in the loop would have to go in and say, yes, that is definitely the root cause. But, you said earlier, one of the observations where people are not doing in-depth investigations. So having usable tools, and usable AI tools like this would really alleviate, observations like the one you were talking about earlier. So when you look at what AI can do for you, you want to really look at your use cases. Where would you get the biggest bang for your buck having a feature of AI with human in the loop? And that's validatable, of course. As you were saying earlier, you have to have the human in the loop. You have to have it validated. It has to have a documented output that if I ask the same questions, I'm always going to get the same output. It can't hallucinate and so on. But yeah, things like that are what I see coming in the industry more and more. And people that are still on paper or have siloed systems will not be able to achieve the efficiencies that AI is going to offer over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
I think we need to stop there with just a minute left to go. If we have further questions, you're always welcome to submit them to stabilityhub.com and go over to the question and answer feature that we have there in our forum. So our time has flown, and once again, we've run out of time before we ran out of stability topics. I'd like to take a moment to highlight our upcoming programs. You can join us again on July 23rd for a webinar on what to think about when accelerated testing produces failing results. On August 13th, a timely webinar on a current stability topic, more likely to be sample control and shipping, by our sponsor Q1 Scientific. On September 9th, that same Q1 Scientific hosts a one-day Stability Studies Conference live in Durham, North Carolina. Watch for announcements and sign-up links in the Stability Hub newsletter and in the events section of StabilityHub.com website. I want to thank our presenter, Walter, our panelists, Doug, Susan, and Emily, for their valuable input to our program, and for you, the worldwide keepers of the stability function, for attending today. We trust you found it informative, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.